Peace, brothers and sisters. My name is Sukant Chandan. I'm one of the coordinators of the Malcolm X movement based here in the heart of whiteness in London. And thank you for offering me the chance to imparting this message of revolutionary solidarity and unity to you. We wish you all successes to your event today and your struggle in general of your organization and the wider struggle that our people are engaged in on this, the important day in the annual calendar, which is African Liberation Day, which, which is made that much more important, forgive me, because this year, 2015, is the 50th anniversary of the martyrdom of one of the greatest strugglers within the so-called West of our liberation struggle, which is Malcolm X. And we in the Malcolm X movement held the first annual Malcolm X Film Festival in April. We're holding the first annual Malcolm X Summer Festival in August, going into early September. And we are committed in staying loyal to the strategy, tactics, ideology that Brother Malcolm set as an example to us all. Now, the reason why Africa is important to the global liberation struggle is this. It's fighting, as Malcolm said, the common enemy. And the common enemy are the regimes based in Paris, London, and Washington, who, despite having their global reach contracted somewhat as a result of the Global South multilateral institutions and struggle, particularly the BRICS and allied forces, are still a global system of white supremacy, of misogyny, of anti-environment policies, and the general colonial matrix of power, to quote the decolonial scholars, which is how colonialism and neocolonialism traumatizes all facets of humans' interaction with each other and humans' interaction with nature and the planet, and also the way colonialism and neocolonialism conducts a genocide against our knowledge systems, against our ideologies, our intergenerational knowledge of our people, which we have used in the in keeping our people healthy and united, etc. So the Malcolm X movement is very much committed to that struggle and the defense of the African continent and the African people. I was reading Fanon just recently, and he was celebrating the independence of China and India, and celebrating the victory of the Vietnamese in Asia against the French colonialists in 1954, which he recognized as a direct support to the African revolutionary, particularly the African countries and people who were suffering under the boot of French colonialism. And the victory in Vietnam had a really massive effect on the African liberation movement across the continent. And again, it's quite pertinent I mentioned that because Malcolm X shares the same birthday, date of birthday with the Vietnamese revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh, and the Malcolm X movement is holding a birthday celebration event for these two lofty comrades of our global struggle this Sunday. Again, going back to Brother Malcolm and the daughters and sons of Malcolm in the Black Panther Party and the other radical black liberation organizations, I think there was two or three fundamental things that they laid out for us to learn from, to apply to our current condition today. One was being fearless and courageous in fighting against this system in its totality, not just being happy with some small, generally superficial changes within the system, which was, I think, defined by the civil rights movement, but what Malcolm brought forward, and then people like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and the Black Panthers and many others, was the quote-unquote Black Power strategy, which was non-compromising, uncompromising, and which sought a total eradication of the system of white supremacy and racism rather than the civil rights reformist agenda. So that was one, black militancy, basically, and Black Power. Two, and none of these things are more important than the other, they kind of complement each other. And two was understanding that the global struggle against neocolonialism is actually posited in the global south, in Africa and Asia and so-called Latin America. And it's these struggles that really are the basis of which that our freedom struggle in the so-called West is predicated on. And Brother Malcolm was very clear about this. He says, as African nations are becoming independent, they are showing much better, much more efficient ways in which that they're ideologically and organizationally achieving their freedom, and there's much for us to learn from them. So 2 is basically global solidarity and learning from and taking leadership from the actually existing struggle of our people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'd like to fast forward it to today. I was in Libya 3 times during 2011 during the NATO project of destroying that country along with its allied death squad forces, who are now running the place in Libya. And Libya was an example of the continuing challenges of neocolonialism that the African continent faces. And remember that Libya 2011 saw on the edge of South Europe the mass persecution and lynching of darker-skinned Libyans and non-Libyan Africans by NATO's allies there. Also, just a few, not so many years ago, Simon Mann and Mark Thatcher from England attempted a military coup against Equatorial Guinea, which was scuppered and sabotaged by our friends in the governments of Zimbabwe and South Africa, again pointing towards the covert operations that the regimes in London, Paris and Washington are still up to today. And also, thanks to Thabo Mbeki, it's been outed that the Brits, and it's clear for anyone who was following the news and Western governments at the time, in the early 2000s, that the British were attempting a military invasion and war of aggression against Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. And the only reason that that did not take place is because the South Africans made it very clear to the British that they were going to have nothing to do with that whatsoever, and they would push back that attempt. And finally, SWAPO leader and Namibian leader Sam Nujoma, a great revolutionary of the African continent and of the global South in general, made it very clear that the West are still up to these dirty games against the African continent. So these are some of the challenges that the African continent is facing, and more recently with the protests in Burundi, I've had emails from senior revolutionaries in Africa saying that this is another neo-colonial color revolution regime change attempt against an African country. And so we should be vigilant to all these different complex machinations, overt and covert, of our common enemy. So really, we are faced now within the West, and the world can see it, that there's an escalating protest movement of our peoples against institutional white supremacy, and particularly deaths by state forces and the police in particular. And whereas it's been inspiring to see this upsurge of protests, it may not be the case that we have yet reached the organizational capacity and the ideological capacity that those before us in the Black liberation movement, particularly of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and others, have shown us how it's to be done. And for sure, we should be learning the negative lessons as well as the positive lessons. And there are negative and positive lessons to be learned from that experience. But really, I think we have to go back to that, to the late 60s and 70s, not to reproduce dogmatically the rhetoric, the ideology and organizational forms, but really to go back to that trench of struggle, that tradition of struggle, that path of struggle that perhaps we kind of have lost out in the last couple of decades. So with that, on behalf of the Malcolm X movement and all the strugglers here on this island on the corner of northwestern windswept Europe, I'd like to wish yourselves, brothers and sisters, the very best for African Liberation Day, and let us unite together more, gather together more, be more rigorous in our ideological and organizational development of our capacity, and look forward along with our leadership in the global South, in Latin America, Asia, and in this case particularly Africa. Unite with them, take leadership with them, be humble in relation to them in this intergenerational struggle against neo-colonialism, whose defeat I'm sure that we will see in the next coming decades. Indeed, the next coming decades is the final chapters of battle in this wider war of liberation of our peoples. With that, I wish you all the best. Thank you.